Hi, everyone. I hope you all are staying healthy and keeping up the hard work. This semester will be over before you know it. Last week, we learned about designing discovery research and analyzing content. This week, we will cover constructing survey research in Chapter 13 and conducting experimental research in Chapter 14. As for assignments, you have a quiz, discussion questions, and you should be working on your research paper, which is due May 2nd. All right, let's get started. As I mentioned previously, Chapter 13 covers how to conduct survey research, and we will draw upon what we learned about conceptual and operational definitions last week in Chapter 11. Throughout this presentation, we'll learn about survey research claims, survey research data, survey research warrants, and ethical issues in survey research. Survey research is one of the most commonly used methodologies inside and outside of academics. One time or another, we've all come across a survey. Survey research can provide researchers insight into associations between certain groups of people. Business owners can use surveys to collect feedback on customer experience, and at the end of each semester, we complete surveys for the courses we took. As you can see, surveys are extremely versatile and can be a great source of information in a myriad of fields. Now, survey research typically uses claims in the format of hypotheses and questions about observable and quantifiable data. These claims generally function in two ways, for exploratory and explanatory purposes. As researchers, we can utilize surveys to explore and identify characteristics that are unique to a particular group of people or messages. Exploratory claims in survey research enable us to learn more about an issue before we attempt to quantify data related to that issue. Now, explanatory claims in survey research can be associative or causal. Associative claims express correlations, and we can use complex ways of measuring data and advanced data analysis techniques to test causality. The bottom line on exploratory and explanatory claims in survey research is that they will help us to understand how to collect and measure data to test our questions and hypotheses. Before we go into detail with survey research data, I'd like to direct your attention to Table 13.4 on page 267, which outlines 8 steps in survey data collection. The first step is to identify data sources and settings, which we will dive into in just a moment. The second step entails selecting a general survey design. Third, we'll need to decide on sampling strategies. Fourth, identify data collection format as interviews or questionnaires. Fifth, we'll develop or identify data collection procedures and instruments. The sixth step is to test interview protocols or questionnaires. Seventh, we assess the validity and reliability of data collection instruments. Finally, we assess the generalizability of the sampled data depending on the sampling strategy selected. Step 1 is to identify data sources and settings. With survey research, we're essentially collecting self-report and other report data to help us identify and understand information pertaining to a large population of people. The setting in which you choose to collect survey data has the potential to impact your data, so we have to be informed about the differences in laboratory and field settings and how each setting makes a difference. If we were to solicit survey responses via social media or email, the setting in which the participants complete the survey may not have much relevance to the study itself. Alternatively, choosing to use a laboratory setting ensures a more controlled environment to facilitate data collection. Within a field setting, you're collecting data where communication is most likely to occur. For instance, if we're conducting research on political fringe groups online, it makes sense to approach these groups in their natural setting, which may be a message board or in the comment section on a certain website. In using surveys as a tool to collect and analyze data, conducting such data collection in a field setting has traditionally been referred to as applied research because it focuses on specific problems in field settings. For an explanation of those two types of applied research, see page 268 in the text. Okay, we have our source for data collection and we've chosen a setting, so we'll move on to actually designing our survey. There are a couple types of survey designs that were discussed in previous chapters, which are cross-sectional surveys and longitudinal surveys. Cross-sectional surveys are most common in communication research, and they essentially provide a snapshot view of communication at one point in time. This means that, as a researcher, you would only have to conduct this survey once with your sample, as opposed to a longitudinal survey, which can occur during long periods of time. The data collected via longitudinal survey can point to trends, which is collecting data from different people at different periods of time, or panel studies, which requires data collection from the same individuals over several periods of time. Your choice in a longitudinal study will be informed by the size of your sample, the characteristics of your sample, and the potential for dropout and mortality. Now that we've settled on a survey design, we need to consider the method we will use to collect our sample of participants. The types of data sampling strategies discussed in the text are random and non-random selection methods. Random sampling methods allow for greater representation of a population. Non-random sampling is ideal for circumstances where there are constraints or where generalizing findings beyond the context of the communication is not necessary. Let's talk about survey interviews and questionnaires. How do we know what type of interview to conduct and what to consider when creating questionnaires? Starting on page 272, we can see several types of survey interviews, including face-to-face interviews, focus groups, mall intercept surveys, which is exactly what it sounds like, and telephone surveys. All of the survey types have their advantages and drawbacks, which are outlined in tables 13.6 and 13.7 on pages 274 and 275, respectively. When choosing an interview style, take the pros and cons into consideration to ensure you choose what you believe will best serve your study and your participants. Another point to consider is the format of survey interviews. Structured interviews have protocols that inform you of what questions to ask and when, and help to prevent interviewer bias. These protocols are defined by certain criteria, including ensuring the number of questions and wording is identical for all participants, the questions are presented in the same order, and the researcher does not attempt to explain or clarify any question. The next interview format to consider is the semi-structured interview, which features the following 4 characteristics. Respondents are asked to reflect on an experience or concept that they all have in common. The questions refer to constructs that have been analyzed and defined prior to the interview. The interviewer follows a guide that specifies topics of interest rather than a strict format. Focus is placed on respondents' understanding of a concept or experience. This type of interview structure allows the respondents to have more freedom in their responses because the research is more exploratory in nature. Finally, the third interview structure detailed in the text is the unstructured interview. Unstructured or non-directive interviews feature the greatest amount of flexibility for interviewers and respondents. This format is used most often in ethnography and conversational and discourse analyses. Another means of collecting survey data is through questionnaires. Questionnaires are very flexible in the sense that they can be completed via various formats like online, by phone, or by mail. When constructing questionnaires, a researcher should consider the length of the questionnaire, the clarity of wording, and the order in which the questions are asked. Chapter 13 also goes into the different types of questions used on surveys, including open-ended questions, which ask for unstructured or spontaneous answers, closed format questions, where respondents are asked to choose an answer from a fixed set of alternatives or a single numerical value, filter and contingency questions. A filter question prompts respondents to answer various parts of a survey. For example, if you answered yes on this question, you'll move on to question 10. If you answered no on this question, you will move on to question 7. And contingency questions depend on responses to filter questions. We also have leading questions, which prompt respondents to answer in a specific way. These types of questions are often provocative and should be avoided to limit the chances of receiving socially accepted answers rather than honest responses. Finally, double-barreled questions ask respondents to answer two things simultaneously. Now that we have a better understanding of the types of survey questions used, let's unpack the elements of questions a little more. In survey research, variables are conceptually and operationally defined and embedded into interview questions or questionnaires by way of operationalization. Last week, we were introduced to operationalization and the levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. As you know, in communication research, we operationalize variables using those different levels of measurement. We can incorporate several measurement levels in one interview or questionnaire. Utilizing nominal and ordinal scales will result in categorical or discrete variables, while measurement via interval and ratio scales yield continuous or scaled variables. Due to the precise data received with interval and ratio scales, we can make inferences with data not available to measurements using ordinal and nominal scales. Table 13.10 on page 284 in the text provides some examples of surveys with multiple variables and scales. So if you need a bit more clarification, please consider checking that out. I want to spend a little time discussing survey research warrants. In survey research, one of our goals is to maximize response rates so we can reliably generalize results that represent larger populations. There are two types of response rates: total response rate, which refers to the percentage of completed and collected surveys, and item response rate, which represents the percentage of completed questions on each survey. Response rates can have a big impact on your findings. How valid or reliable are data collected from a questionnaire that had a 25% response rate and of that a 70% item response rate? Of course, it will depend on other factors involved in your research, but you can imagine how the use of this data may not provide a view of the bigger picture of which you're attempting to understand or predict because your data was truncated. So, how can we establish measurement validity and reliability? Well, measurement validity requires a rationale for how one arrived at a definition of a variable, and these assessments are companions to estimation of reliability. Reliability can be established via stability, homogeneity, and equivalence in measurements. All that this means is your surveys should be able to achieve consistent measurements that can be relied upon. Conducting assessments of validity and reliability and including them in your research bolsters your argument. Finally, we've reached the end of chapter 13, and it seems the authors left one of the most important of considerations for last: ethical issues in survey research. Participation in research should be completely voluntary, and we as researchers have an obligation to inform people of risks that may arise from their participation. We must consider measures to ensure anonymity, if possible, or confidentiality for participants in face-to-face interviews and focus groups. Researchers must also guarantee safe storage and destruction of data once we complete the analysis. What happens if the data don't support our theories or hypotheses? It would be unethical to suppress or alter information that doesn't support our claims, and such actions would ruin your credibility as a researcher. So always keep in mind that accuracy in reporting is a responsibility of ours that cannot be ignored. This chapter was pretty thorough and took a good amount of time to review, but I hope I was able to explain the different considerations in this chapter in a way that you understand. As always, please call, text, or email me if you have any questions.